I think conflict tends to bring out the absolutely the worst in our behavior towards each other, and often the best when we, those who fight against or rise above. And so it's a lot of, as artists, a lot of our work is the study of what it is to be human. So these extremes of the human condition are what we're trying to understand.
Gavin Malone sat at his desk, the hum of the office's fluorescent lights buzzing above him. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, scanning through files that seemed to blur together in monotony. The work was unimportant, yet there was a heaviness in the air, a weight that had been growing ever since he stumbled across the name, Angelina Jolie. The name sent a chill down his spine, the memories flooding in. Once, she had been a fellow soldier in a war zone, someone he had trusted. Now, she was nothing but a name on a file, one he shouldn't have opened. Gavin had always considered himself a man of control, but in this moment, he felt his grip slipping. He had been chasing shadows for years, never once thinking about the ghosts of the past he would eventually have to confront. But there it was, in plain sight, Angelina Jolie's name, highlighted in the file labeled Viper's Kiss. His heartbeat quickened, and he leaned forward in his chair, eyes scanning the lines of text that chronicled her involvement in operations far darker than anything he had imagined. Angelina Jolie was not just a soldier. She was a shadow, a weapon, designed for assassination, buried deep within covert operations that had been erased from all records. He couldn't believe what he was reading. Gavin closed the file quickly, his mind reeling with questions. He stood up from his desk, a hand running through his hair as he paced around the small office. Angelina had disappeared years ago, just vanished off the grid, and no one had heard from her since. The file detailed operations, her assignments, things. No one could have known unless they had been directly involved. But that wasn't what unsettled him the most. It was the stark reminder that the woman he had once fought beside had been living a completely different life than the one he remembered. He couldn't understand it, and worse, he couldn't ignore it. The file was a key to unlocking a dark past that no one was meant to uncover. His fingers hovered over the stack of files on his desk, the room now feeling smaller, suffocating. He knew the consequences of digging too deep, but his curiosity overwhelmed him. He had to find out more. It wasn't just about uncovering the truth anymore. It was about confronting the ghost of Angelina Jolie. He needed to know what she had become, what she had done, and whether he was prepared to face it. With a deep breath, Gavin placed the file back into the cabinet, closing the drawer with a finality that didn't settle his unease. The investigation would have to wait until tomorrow, but as the weight of Angelina Jolie's name lingered in the room, he knew it was only a matter of time before the truth found its way to him. The next few days felt like a slow descent into madness for Gavin Malone. Each time he closed his eyes, the name Angelina Jolie flashed before him, her shadow growing longer with every passing hour. His mind refused to let go of the file, the image of Angelina Jolie embedded in his thoughts like a wound that wouldn't heal. The details of her assignments haunted him, a constant reminder that there were things about her he had never known. He could no longer ignore the pull to discover the truth. Gavin paced around his apartment, his fingers drumming impatiently against the table. His decision to follow the trail had been made, but his mind kept circling back to the same question. What was he truly getting into? He had worked in the shadows for years, but the more he thought about Angelina Jolie and her involvement in covert operations, the more he realized just how far down the rabbit hole he was willing to go. If he followed this thread, there would be no turning back. After a restless night, Gavin booked a flight to Prague. The file had mentioned a hotel on the outskirts of the city, an obscure location that held significance to Angelina Jolie's past. It was the kind of place where only shadows dared to linger, and Gavin knew if he were to find anything about her, it would be there. He packed his things methodically, ensuring everything was in place. His movements were precise, a reflection of the man he had always been, always in control, always calculating. Upon arrival, the cold air of Prague greeted him, the city's narrow, cobbled streets offering no warmth. Gavin checked into the hotel, a small, unremarkable building that seemed to blend in with the dreary surroundings. The room was dimly lit, with little more than a bed and a desk. The silence felt suffocating, almost as if the city itself was, waiting for something to happen. As he sat by the window, he couldn't shake the feeling that Angelina Jolie was already aware of his presence. He had never been one to believe in coincidence, and he had no doubt that she was watching him, even now. His mind wandered back to their days in Africa. He remembered how Angelina Jolie had never flinched at the horrors they faced, her eyes always focused, always cold. She had been a professional, a perfect tool for their missions. But now, the woman he remembered seemed so far removed from the figure in the file. What had happened to her? What had changed? He couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility, as if somehow, in some way, he had played a part in her transformation. But those thoughts were secondary to the task at hand. The knock at the door came at midnight. Gavin's heart raced, and he moved instinctively, his hand hovering over the weapon tucked beneath his jacket. He opened the door slowly, his eyes locking onto the figure standing in the doorway. The figure was shrouded in darkness. But there was no mistaking who it was. Angelina Jolie stood before him, her silhouette barely visible in the dim light. She didn't say anything at first. Her eyes were cold, calculating, just as they had been in the past. Gavin's pulse quickened. He had known she would come, but nothing could prepare him for the impact of seeing her again. Her presence filled the room, and for a moment it felt like time had stood still. He stepped back, allowing her to enter, but his instincts were on high alert. He couldn't let his guard down, not with Angelina Jolie, not with the secrets she carried. This wasn't just about the file anymore. This was personal. The woman he had once fought beside, the woman he had once trusted, was standing before him as a ghost from the past, and Gavin wasn't sure if he was ready to face the truth that she might bring with her. Gavin Malone watched as Angelina Jolie stepped into the room, the door creaking shut behind her with an unsettling finality. The space between them was thick with unspoken tension, the kind that only shared history could create. He felt his heart race, a mix of dread and anticipation. The woman standing before him was no longer the familiar comrade he had once trusted in the field. Angelina Jolie had become something else, a figure wrapped in secrecy and shadows. Her eyes, though cold, flickered with something that Gavin couldn't quite place. He could feel her studying him, just as she always had in the past, assessing him with that same sharp gaze. But there was no warmth in those eyes now, no camaraderie, only a hollow emptiness. Angelina Jolie didn't speak immediately. She simply stood there, her posture rigid, her expression unreadable. Gavin, unsure of what to say, felt a growing unease in the pit of his stomach. His mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of the past, to reconcile the woman he had known with the one who now stood before him. He took a step forward, his voice steady, but filled with the weight of his questions. His words came out in a low, controlled tone, but the urgency was undeniable. The years of silence between them hung in the air like a suffocating fog. Gavin knew this was no longer about gathering information or solving a puzzle. It was about confronting the truth, whatever that truth may be. Angelina Jolie was not just a shadow from his past. She was the key to a mystery that had eluded him for too long. But instead of answering, Angelina Jolie turned her back on him and walked toward the window. She gazed out at the city below, the night cloaking her figure in darkness. Gavin felt an unfamiliar frustration bubbling inside him. He had always been a man of action, a man who solved problems with precision. But this moment was different. The woman in front of him refused to follow the script he had written in his mind. He had come here expecting answers, but Angelina Jolie seemed determined to keep him in the dark. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, almost a whisper. The words carried a weight that pressed down on him, making him feel as if the room had suddenly become much smaller. Angelina Jolie didn't need to raise her voice to command attention. Her presence alone was enough to make Gavin's pulse quicken, but the words that came from her lips were not what he had expected. "I didn't want you to find out," she said, her tone revealing a vulnerability Gavin had never seen before. The admission startled him, knocking him off balance. This was not the cold, detached Angelina Jolie he had known. There was something more, something personal, and it unsettled him deeply. Gavin struggled to understand, but the pieces weren't falling into place. He had thought she was simply a tool, a soldier with no past, no future, just a weapon to be used and discarded. But now, in the face of this woman who had once stood beside him in the heat of battle, he realized how little he had known about her. The reality of who Angelina Jolie had become hit him like a wave, crashing through his thoughts, forcing him to question everything he had believed about her, about himself. She turned back toward him, her gaze now piercing, as if daring him to ask the question he was too afraid to voice. Gavin opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. The truth seemed impossible to comprehend. Angelina Jolie had been more than he had ever realized. She had been a part of something much darker, much deeper than he could have imagined. And now, standing in front of her, Gavin knew there was no going back. Whatever happened next, whatever truth was revealed, he would never be able to unsee it. Her eyes locked onto his, and for the first time, Gavin saw something that wasn't just cold calculation. There was regret there, a deep, gnawing regret that haunted her every move. Angelina Jolie had done things, terrible things, and now she was trapped by them. Her past was no longer just her own. It was tied to him now, to the very moment he had opened that file. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The ghost of Angelina Jolie was not just someone from his past. She was his present, his future, and the weight of what that meant was slowly crushing him. Gavin's mind reeled, unable to process it all. But there was no time to think, no time to ask more questions. Angelina Jolie had already made it clear there was no easy way out of this. And as the seconds ticked by, Gavin knew the reckoning had only just begun. Gavin Malone stood frozen, his mind swirling with everything he had just learned. Angelina Jolie's presence was no longer just a shadow in the room. It had become a tangible weight, pressing down on him with the force of years of deception. Her eyes, once cold and calculating, were now filled with something far more dangerous: vulnerability. It was a vulnerability Gavin had never expected from her, the woman who had been an unstoppable force in the field. He couldn't reconcile the figure before him with the ruthless assassin he had known. Angelina Jolie was no longer just a ghost from the past. She was a living, breathing reminder of how easily everything could be shattered. Her words still lingered in the air, hanging like a dark cloud. She hadn't wanted him to find out, hadn't wanted to drag him into whatever twisted web she had been caught in. Gavin felt a chill run through him, not from the coldness of the room, but from the realization that Angelina Jolie had been playing a much deeper game than he had ever realized. The file had been a mere surface, a glimpse into a past Gavin had foolishly assumed he understood. But now, staring at Angelina Jolie, he knew that the truth ran far deeper than anything he could have anticipated. He took a slow step toward her, his eyes never leaving hers. The familiar coldness of her demeanor had been replaced by something far more disorienting, a fragility that didn't belong. Gavin reached for the notebook she had handed him earlier, the weight of it still heavy in his hands. He had hesitated to open it, but now there was no avoiding it. Angelina Jolie had given him the key to her past, to the dark truth she had buried for so long. She had placed her life into his hands, and Gavin knew that once he opened that book, there would be no going back. His fingers trembled slightly as he opened the first page. The words inside were written in a precise, almost mechanical style. Details about operations, names of people, locations. Angelina Jolie's past was laid bare before him, each page a reminder of the things she had done, the people she had betrayed, and the cost of the life she had chosen. The names were familiar, but not in the way he had expected. These were not the names of the enemies he had thought she had killed. These were the names of her own allies, the people who had worked alongside her in the shadows. Gavin's mind raced as he flipped through the pages, each line revealing a new layer of betrayal, a new revelation about the woman standing before him. He could feel the weight of the burden pressing down on him, the truth becoming too much to bear. Angelina Jolie had tried to warn him, had tried to keep him away from this darkness. But now, there was no turning back. The truth was out, and it was up to Gavin to decide what to do with it. His instincts screamed at him to walk away, to leave the past where it belonged. But there was a part of him, the part that had trusted Angelina Jolie once, that couldn't ignore the pain in her eyes. He couldn't turn his back on her now, not after everything they had been through together. Gavin closed the notebook, his mind spinning with the implications of what he had just read. Angelina Jolie was no longer the assassin he had once known. She was someone different now, someone broken by the very choices she had made. But as he looked at her, standing in front of him, he realized that she wasn't the only one who had been changed by the past. He had changed too. The man who had walked into this hotel room searching for answers was no longer the same man who stood there now. The truth had altered him just as much as it had altered her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The room was filled with a heavy silence broken only by the distant sounds of the city below. Angelina Jolie's eyes never left his, as if she were waiting for him to make the next move. Gavin had thought he had all the answers, but now, with the burden of truth weighing down on him, he realized there were no easy answers. The past could never be undone. The choices made could never be erased. And as the weight of Angelina Jolie's secrets pressed down on him, Gavin knew that whatever path he chose now, it would lead him somewhere he could never return from. The reckoning had come, and there was no escaping it.